Hi everyone, it's been a 007 at Vassals of Kingsgrave, and in the words of Tolkien, a wizard is never late. He arrives precisely when he means to, which is why on Christmas Day we are publishing an episode of the Agatha Christie reread covering Halloween. It is indeed a minipod, and it's the 60th episode of our Agatha Christie linear reread. The book is Halloween Party, originally published in November 69, when Agatha Christie is an amazing 79 years old. I think we all wish we could be so creative and so on the ball at such an age. As normal, this will be spoiler free to the end credits music. So, this novel comes after The Pricking of My Thumbs, the Tommy and Tuppence novel, which is also rather spooky, I feel, and before a kind of shambolically rambling thriller novel called Passenger to Frankfurt, which I am not looking forward to rereading. The setup of the novel is as follows. Ariadne Oliver is at a house in the country, and that house is hosting a Halloween party with lots of the local children in attendance and apple bobbing and lots of other games. One of the girls, who is known to be a bit of a liar, claims that she has witnessed a murder, but she didn't realize it was a murder at the time. No one takes her seriously because of her reputation, but later on that evening, she is found drowned in an apple bobbing bucket. I wonder how many people know what apple bobbing is these days or whether kids still do it, but certainly in the 80s, that was very much a feature of my childhood Halloweens. So Ariadne Oliver calls in her mate Hercule Poirot to help solve the mystery. And the question is, who killed the little Girl Scout and what did she witness? So it's both a current and a retrospective murder. This novel also has a really cool dedication to P.G. Woodhouse. And if you remember those novels of the 20s, we sometimes said that as Agatha Christie was trying to find her own style, sometimes her novels would have a very Woodhouseian, humorous edge to them, particularly in characters like Bundle Brent. So the dedication on this book is to P.G. Woodhouse, whose books and stories have brightened my life for many years, also to show my pleasure in his having been kind enough to tell me that he enjoys my books, which is a really lovely. I mean, it could be seen as a humble brag, but I don't think it is. I think it's genuine delight. So we are at the end of the 1960s. This is the last of the 1960s novels, and there's plenty of social change to observe. I'm going to list them fairly quickly, actually, because they're mentioned in passing. The dreaded 11 plus exam has been phased out. For non Brits, this is an exam that all kids had to take, and then they were sort of sorted into schools. So the most academic were put in grammar schools and destined for university. Others were put in secondary modern schools and were meant to learn more practical skills. This was quite a sort of socially divisive thing. It was a sort of one shot pony, right? So if you somehow messed up your exam, you had been sorted into the wrong stream. But that was phased out. There is reference to plastic things. So consumer plastics are now making an appearance. We have teenagers snogging on the stairs at the Halloween party, continuing mentions as we've had through the 60s of drugs, in this case, pot and LSD. The suburban commuter town is now a feature of England. Societal protections against marrying a bad lot have eroded. This is something that Christie talks a lot about, that the young girls have no one to advise them these days and so make bad choices. We have a reference to computers. We have references to permissive sex. Again, something we see in a lot of 1960s Agatha. Hanging has been abolished, so we have no more hanging of murderers. Lots of talk about the development of psychiatric care, so psychiatric reports, mental cases, lenient sentences, so we are more in a progressive era. Letters aren't written but typewritten. Open discussion of lesbians, exclamation mark, and that will also come in Miss Marple's Nemesis, the next novel that we are going to read that's a Marple, and also the topic of child grooming, which is rather sinister. Here are a few supporting quotations. So this is the description of Medchester where the action takes place, and it is indeed a suburban commuter town. Quote, "It's one of those places where there are a few nice houses, but where a certain amount of new building has been done. Residential, a good school nearby, and people can commute from there to London or into Medchester. It's quite an ordinary sort of place where people with what you might call everyday reasonable incomes live. Sounds exactly like the kind of residential we need more of in England and maybe in America and lots of other places these days. And here's a quotation about poor girls who no longer have adequate protections. Quote, I suspect that girls have always been partial to the bad lots, as you say, but in the past there were safeguards. That's right, people were looking after them. Their mothers looked after them, their aunts and their older sisters looked after them, their younger sisters and brothers knew what was going on. The fathers were not averse to kicking the wrong men out of the house. Sometimes, of course, the girls used to run away with one of the bad lots. Nowadays, there's no need even to do that. Mother doesn't know who the girl's out with. Father's not told who the girl is out with. Brothers know who the girl is out with, but think more fool her. If the parents refuse consent, the couple go before a magistrate and manage to get permission to marry. And then when the young man, who everyone knows is a bad lot, proceeds to prove to everybody, including his wife, that he is a bad lot, the fat's in the fire. But love's love. The girl doesn't want to think that her Henry has these revolting habits, these criminal tendencies, and all the rest of it. She'll lie for him, swear black's white for him, and everything else. Yes, it's difficult. Difficult for us, I mean. Well, there's no good on saying things were better in the old days. Perhaps we only thought so. End quote. And this is also a theme that would be picked up in Nemesis. And yes, here's the first hint of a computer, and this is between Mrs. Oliver and Hercule Poirot. Quote, do you know what you sound like, said Mrs. Oliver. A computer, you know. You're programming yourself. That's what they call it, isn't it? I mean, you're feeding all these things into yourself all day, and then you're going to see what comes out. It is certainly an idea you have there, said Poirot, with some interest. Yes, yes, I play the part of the computer. One feeds in the information. And supposing you come up with all the wrong answers, said Mrs. Oliver. That would be impossible, said Hercule Poirot. Computers do not do that sort of thing. End quote. And I think that falls into the honorary Xander Lord Baron Hercule Poirot being Hercule Poirot category of this podcast. So lots and lots of social change. And as ever, Agatha Christie comments on it, but she's not particularly regressive. Like, I mean, she knows that the march must go on. So she's never that nostalgic about things, but she does comment on change. And now, what are the social changes that would have greeted the reader as they got their Christie for Christmas in 1969? Well, December 1968, Douglas Engelbart publicly demonstrates his pioneering hypertext system, NLS, in San Francisco, together with the computer mouse. That's amazing, isn't it? I had no idea that the computer mouse was invented so early. Also, the crewed US spacecraft Apollo 8 enters orbit around the moon. January 1969, end of the siege of the University of Tokyo, marking the beginning of the end of the 1968-69 Japanese university protests. January 20th, Richard Nixon is sworn in as the 37th President of the United States. February 69, the 747 jumbo jet flies for the first time. March 1969, the first ever Concorde test flight. Sirhan admits killing RFK in court. Conspiracy theories ensue. And Apollo 9 successfully tests lunar module. And John Lennon and Yoko Ono marry. In April 1969, an American teenager known as Robert R. dies in St. Louis, Missouri of a baffling medical condition. In 1984, it will be identified as the earliest confirmed case of HIV/AIDS in North America. That's amazing that that was so early and it was circulating sort of quietly and at lower numbers all the way through the 1970s. May 1969, we have the Apollo 10 full test. June 1969, the Stonewall riots that will spark a movement and an organization. July 1969, first US troops withdraw from Vietnam, and the Apollo 11 moon landing. Conspiracy theorists and nutjobs ensue. And Chappaquiddick. Oh, more conspiracy theories ensue about another of the Kennedy brothers potentially being involved in killing a woman through bad driving that he was having an affair with. I'll leave you to research on that. But very, very subject to conspiracies, all of this stuff. August 1969, the tragic Manson family murder of Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and others. Oh, what a horrible, horrible chapter of American history. And we have Woodstock. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? Sort of feels like that's hippie flower power, love, free love movement was at its height, but also the sinister forces being set up for everything going wrong and the disappointments that came thereafter in the early 70s. October 1969, the last known murder of the Zodiac Killer. For those of you interested in serial killers and theories, there's a whole thread on the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord devoted to this. The first message is sent over ARPANET, the forerunner of the internet. Again, I'm always amazed at how early these technological advances took place. And very beloved to my heart and my childhood, the first episode of Sesame Street airs on PBS. There are lots of Christie verse references in this novel, which is really wonderful. There are a lot of references to Mrs. McGinty's dead, with Superintendent Spence. In chapter 10, Miss Emlyn mentions that she knows of Poirot from Miss Bulstrode, who was the wonderful headmistress in Cat Among the Pigeons, and a sort of another version of Miss Bulstrode will appear in the Miss Marple Nemesis novel too. So maybe that was a little bit on Agatha Christie's mind. When Joyce, the Girl Scout who's going to be murdered, mentions to Mrs. Oliver that she should have a themed party around a fake murder, Ariadne's like, never again, which is clearly a reference to Dead Man's Folly. We also have an appearance from Mr. Goby, who is a private investigator that often helps out Poirot. Goes back actually as long as The Mystery of the Blue Train, appears also in After the Funeral and Third Girl. And we have more nursery rhymes. Mrs. Goodbody is going to use, well, she's the local gossip, and she's going to hint at what might have happened to someone by Ding Dong Dell, Pussy's in the Well, which is an old nursery rhyme. What's the style of this novel? I mean, this is the era when Agatha Christie is starting to dictate novels rather than write them, and many people have commented that they get baggier and looser. I've just reread Nemesis, and my goodness, there's so much repetition in that, where you can see she's dictating and sort of almost reformulating how she's going to phrase things. And I think you could take a good 80 pages out of that novel, which runs to 300 in my paperback edition. I think this novel is also rather repetitive. Ariadne, Oliver, and Spence being briefed again and again. Oh, yes. I think that this is a good novel in its core, in its solution, in its puzzle mysteryness. It kind of works, the clues work. But I think, as in some of these later novels, you can really strip away some of the text. And therefore, I think this is mid-tier Christie, but I think this is better than some of the other 1960s novels, to be sure. Okay, let's get into the characters, and we'll start with the investigators. So Hercule Poirot, our Belgian detective, called in to investigate the murder of Joyce Reynolds. Here are some quotations. Many of the evenings were dull now, Hercule Poirot thought. His mind, magnificent as it was, for he had never doubted that fact, required stimulation from outside sources. And here he is pondering beauty. This book is going to be very concerned with beauty and what people will do when they value beauty. Quote, he would not have liked to be a beautiful young man himself, not that there had ever been the least chance of that. There was only one thing about his own appearance which really pleased Hercule Poirot, and that was the profusion of his moustaches, and the way they responded to grooming and treatment and trimming. They were magnificent. He knew of nobody else who had any moustache half as good. He had never been handsome or good-looking, certainly never beautiful, end quote. And that's rather lovely. And then we have, of course, Ariadne Oliver, our crime fiction writer, very much an avatar for Agatha Christie. And here we have Agatha Christie's attitude on taxation, which we mentioned in our podcast, Endless Night. Quote, but you've written a lot of books, said Joyce. You make a lot of money out of them, don't you? In a way, said Mrs. Oliver, her thoughts flying to the inland revenue. So this is obviously Agatha pondering how much tax she's paying. Joyce goes on. And you've got a detective who's a Finn. Mrs. Oliver admitted the fact. A small, stolid boy, not yet, Mrs. Oliver would have thought, arrived at the seniority of the 11 plus, said sternly. Why a Finn? I've often wondered, said Mrs. Oliver truthfully. Investigators also include the aforementioned Superintendent Spence, who is now retired, and also Elspeth Mackay, one of Christie's sensible, smart sisters that we've seen really from all the way back to the murder of Roger Ackroyd. Now let's get into some of the people who we meet. Joyce Reynolds, the first victim of the case, a 13-year-old girl attending Rowena Drake's Halloween party, declared she once saw a murder. Joyce has a mother, Mrs. Reynolds, a younger brother, Leopold, and a big sister, Anne. Miss Rowena Drake is the one who hosted the party. She seems like a very practical, sensible, middle-aged woman. She's a widow. Her husband was run over by a car. So Mr. and Mrs. Drake have an elderly aunt called Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe who dies 2 years before the novel begins. And she left them a whole bunch of money. So the widow, Rowena Drake, is actually rather wealthy. But there was a bit of sort of tension over that because Last minute, she apparently had changed her will to leave it to Olga Semenov, the au pair from Herzegovina. But apparently that codicil to the will was forged and Olga then disappeared, so that money did indeed come to Mrs. Drake. Now we have Ariadne Oliver's host, who is Judith Butler. She's also a widow, actually. Her husband was a pilot who died in a motorway car crash. Again, sign of the times, we have motorway car crashes now. Judith has a little girl who's 12 years old called Miranda. She's the best friend of Joyce, the girl who was murdered. They're both students at the local school, but Miranda didn't actually go to the party because she was ill that night. We have Miss Emlyn, who's the headmistress of the school and therefore knows both girls. Dr. Ferguson, there's always a doctor in the village, isn't there? We have Elizabeth Whitaker, a maths and Latin teacher at the school. She was also at the party. Also at the house, there is a gardener called Michael Garfield. He's a landscape gardener, though, not one of the normal maintenance gardeners. And he's meant to be one of these late 60s dandy-ish romantic people with long hair, very good looking, recently come back to the area, known for being unusually beautiful and fascinated with beauty. And we have a few other sundry characters in the village. So as we go forward, we realise that there have been more mysterious disappearances or deaths in the recent past, and the investigation broadens out. And it is quite a sinister book. And I would say if you watch the adaptation, it does manage to achieve that tone. So I think this is a really good read. I really was clued into the puzzle mystery. I think the psychology of why the murders were committed feels very real and very tragic. And yes, I think if you can get through the bagginess, this really is worth a read. I think I'm being a little bit more generous, however, than the reviews at the time, which were apparently more negative. This is what Robert Bernard, who wrote in 1980, said. He said that Halloween Party has the feel of something spoken into a dictaphone and transcribed without editing, which is actually unfair because according to John Curran, who's been through all the Agatha Christie notebooks and all the archives, she did really edit this, but still it's baggy and you sort of feel that Collins, the publisher, might have taken more of a forceful side to this work and Nemesis and those that follow. Is the novel progressive or regressive? This is something that we ask a lot. And I think Agatha Christie has always criticised people who are regressive and who are stuck in the past and too conservative. Even as she appreciates some of the things that have gone wrong with modernity, she always feels that you can't stop it and there's no point being sentimental about it. So I read that passage earlier where she laments that those kind of social structures that protected young girls aren't in place anymore. But then she also criticises conservatives like the stern lawyer and Mrs. Drake. So here's a quotation. You do not believe in the maxim, the fate of every man have we bound about his neck? Mrs. Drake looked extremely doubtful and slightly displeased. An Islamic saying, I believe, said Poirot. Mrs. Drake looked unimpressed. I hope, she said, we do not take our ideas, or perhaps I should say our ideals, from the Middle East. So Mrs. Drake is showing herself to be small-minded, but I think we're definitely meant to side with Poirot and dislike Mrs. Drake for that opinion. In terms of adaptations, there has only been one, and that is part of the epic ITV Poirot series starring David Suchet as Hercule Poirot. It's actually really well done. I really, really like this adaptation. It's one of the better of the later ones. And we have Zoe Wanamaker as Ariadne Oliver. The whole cast is really good. You've got Deborah Finlay as Rowena Drake, Julian Rhind-Tutt as Michael Garfield, Fenella Woolgar, smaller role as Elizabeth Whitaker, a really nicely broadened and deepened role that Mark Gatiss wrote the screenplay. And I think it's really well done. It's really well done. The setting is moved back as it was with all these Poirots from the 60s to the 30s. There are a few changes, but mostly this is faithful to the plotting and the solution of who did it. On that note, I will move to the spoiler section. Do not listen if you haven't yet read the book. I will be back next time for another mini pod for the rather shambolic Passenger to Frankfurt, but then we will all reunite and have a full podcast on Nemesis. Thank you for listening. Okay, folks, we're now going to get into the spoiler section of this book. Here are some clues. We know that Joyce copies other people's stories and embellishes them. So even though she's a liar, what she says about a murder having been witnessed by someone is probably true. And think about who her best friend is, the best friend who wasn't at the party, Miranda. That should make you think that maybe Miranda saw a murder, especially as we see her through the novel being rather voyeuristic, climbing up trees and watching people. Then, the most obvious clue of all is that whoever drowned Joyce would have been covered in water because you're drowning someone in an apple bobbing bucket. And the broken vase is a ruse to cover up the wetness. So, obviously, it must be Mrs. Rowena Drake who committed the murder. And her looking askance at the library is all pure staging. And Agatha Christie uses that device of sort of a misdirect through where someone is looking many times, most notably in the mirror crack side to side. Another clue is whether Olga's codicil was real or not, and this is where Hercule Poirot, with his connections, can prove that it was indeed real, and therefore we have the suspicious murder of Olga back in the day. We find out that Michael Garfield paid for a second forgery by Ferrier, so a forgery that would be very obviously exposed as such. And therefore you get to the motive, and the motive is money. Rowena Drake needs to inherit the money. She also needs to be a widow and free to marry. It's never cleared up in the book as to whether she killed her first husband. It's left ambiguous, although the ITV adaptation says that she did. So she clears out of the way her first husband. She clears out of the way Olga so that she can inherit the money with her accomplice, Michael Garfield, because he is indeed her lover. I don't think he actually loves her. She definitely is obsessed and loves him because he's so beautiful. He is just using her for her money. He wants to buy a Greek island and make a beautiful, epic landscape garden there, and that is what he needs the money for. The only bit that I found a little bit implausible is that he had previously had an affair with Miranda's mother, and that her sort of first husband who died in the motorway car crash is actually fictitious and something that she made up so that she could look respectable, and that in fact Miranda is his daughter. I think it's rather sad. And at the end, we have a very sort of good description of Rowena Drake as Lady Macbeth, who's committing all the murders for the sake of her husband. But her husband, or her lover, sorry, in this case, Michael Garfield, is Narcissus. He's a pure narcissist. He wants all of these things to happen so that he can just further his own vision of beauty, of which he is a key part. So it's a very tragic ending because it's done for love, but there's no real love there or no reciprocated love. So I think the character of Mrs. Rowena Drake is really a very tragic one. And so from that perspective, I've always felt that even though this is a slightly baggier novel, it's really well done as to the psychology, as to the characterization. And I really felt for poor Joyce, who everyone mocks and calls a bit clumsy and fat. And, she's obviously not a very attractive young girl. I've always felt for Mrs. Rowena Drake. And it's a very convincing story, I feel. So I am a little bit more generous towards this, I have to say. I think it is one of the better, later Hercule Poirot novels. With that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Join us next time for Passenger to Frankfurt. And if you want to get involved in the Agatha Christie conversation or any other of our wonderful nerdy conversations, join us on the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord. In the meanwhile, have a very happy and wonderful holiday season if you celebrate, and we'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.